I learned to drive in a tank. Okay, not a tank. It was a 1973 Ford LTD, my mother's, and I was 12. She called her car the Blue Bomb. I'm not even joking. But if you've ever sat behind the wheel of a full-sized Ford from the early 70s, you'll know the difference is mostly philosophical. The thing was the length of a canoe and steered like you were giving suggestions to a continent. And I learned to drive it badly, gloriously, at maybe 15 kilometers per hour on a set of wide, quiet, perfectly gridded streets on the north side of Edmonton. We didn't call it a neighbourhood. We didn't call it Griesbach. And honestly, half the city still mispronounces it. Back then, we just called it the base, because that's what it was. A real working army base inside the city with a gate and a parade square and rows of identical houses where soldiers' families lived. My stepdad was retired by then, 3 PPCLI and airborne, which in our house was said the way other families might say a hometown or a religion. He still had army buddies living in the PMQs out there, and so we'd go out and visit, and the grown-ups would do whatever the grown-ups did, and I'd be turned loose with the keys to the land yacht on roads that were, at that hour, gorgeously, miraculously empty. But I was always told, watch out for the MPs and stop at the stop sign. I have lived within walking distance of that place since the late 1970s, and I still do. And here's the thing that I want to talk with you about today. The thing that got under my skin and would not leave. The base is gone. The gate is gone. The parade square is gone. And in its place, there's a village now. That's the actual marketing word. Village. With 4 little lakes and walking trails and character homes and a 2-acre community garden. And it is genuinely lovely. And people pay real money to live there because it's one of the most desirable addresses in North Edmonton. And in the middle of it, at a roundabout near the entrance, there is a bronze man on a bronze horse. Most people who drive past him every day could not tell you his name. Yet his name is on their street signs. His name's on their mail. His name is the name of the whole place. Who is the man on the horse? Why is it a master-planned suburb with stormwater ponds named after a soldier most Edmontonians have never heard of? What was here before the houses, before the base, before the gate? And what does it mean, really, not just on a plaque, to build your kitchen on top of a parade square? This one's personal. This is the ground I grew up on. Let's dig. Welcome to the 31st episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the lives and sacrifices of soldiers and veterans from the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thanks again for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. Today, we're going to explore a little bit of the north side of Edmonton, Alberta. Not all of the north side of Edmonton is bad. Some of it's kind of cool. And, just on that note, there seems to be a theme here in Canada anyway. Why is it always that the north end or the north side of the city is always like the bad side? You think of Winnipeg. I think Winnipeg's north end is legendary. Anyway, it was just a passing thought. However, we're going to explore one particular neighborhood that I think goes back in anybody who's Gen X or older, goes back a long way in their memory if you've done any growing up in this town. Like I said, this one's personal, so let's get digging. Before we get into it, one quick thing, because it'll mean more if I tell you now. In a few minutes, I'm going to take you down through the layers of this North Edmonton neighborhood. The man on the horse, the streets that are secretly footnotes, the parade square that's a park now. And when we're done, you're going to want to go stand on it. So here's how. I've built and produced a free, self-guided audio walking tour called the Griesbach Walk. 7 stops, your own 2 feet, my voice in your ear, and it's waiting for you at www.memoryandvalor.ca. It's also going to be featured in the 30th Annual Historic Festival and Doors Open, July 5th to 12th, and that's hosted by the Edmonton and District Historical Society. 30 years of this city digging up its own backyard. So make it an after-dinner walk. Bring earbuds or bring a friend, even better. Hand them one earbud and split it. Remembrance goes down easier in pairs. Okay, hold that thought. Let's get into the episode. Let's start with the Bronze Man, because everything else in this story radiates out from him like spokes on a wheel. His name was William Antrobus Griesbach, born the 3rd of January, 1878 in Fort Qu'Appelle, which at the time wasn't even Saskatchewan yet. It was the Northwest Territories. And right away you get the sense that this is a kid who was born into the bloodstream of the Canadian West. His father, Arthur Henry Griesbach, has a claim to fame that is almost too good to be true. He was, by the record, the very first man to enlist in the Northwest Mounted Police, which was the predecessor to the RCMP in this country. He was number 1 on the rolls in 1873, which makes him, in effect, Canada's first Mountie. He'd soldiered in the British Army and out in the Cape before he emigrated, and when Sir John A. Macdonald willed the Mounties into existence, Arthur Griesbach was the first in the door. He rode west as a sergeant major on the legendary 1874 March West, that almost mythological trek of the force out across the prairie to plant Canadian authority on the plains, and later commanded the post at Fort Saskatchewan, just up the road from Edmonton. So picture the household young William grew up in. A father who helped bring the apparatus of the Canadian state to a place that, in living memory, had been Cree and Métis and sometimes Blackfoot country, fur trade country, Hudson's Bay country. We're going to come back to that hard later on because it matters enormously to whose land we're actually standing on. But just hold on to it for now. The family came west the hard way. When the father was posted to command Fort Saskatchewan in 1883, they traveled by rail to Calgary and then by wagon train north. And the detail I love, the one William himself set down years later in his memoir, is that the road was barely a cart track and the party kept having to stop and build or repair the bridges just to get across the rivers. You didn't just arrive in Edmonton in 1883. You had to assemble the route as you went. William gets shipped off to school. St. John's College in Winnipeg. It's an Anglican school. And side note here, my grandfather actually went to the same school about 30 years later. But anyway, I digress. He graduates in 1895, comes back to Edmonton, reads law. And then in 1899, he does the thing that young men of the British Empire did in 1899. He enlists to go fight in South Africa, the Boer War, the South African War. He serves with the Canadian Mounted Rifles, and he comes home with the Queen's South Africa Medal. The sources say with 4 bars, meaning 4 clasps for separate actions or campaigns. Now, here's where Griesbach becomes a genuinely interesting human being and not just a resume. Because he comes home to Edmonton from that war, hangs out his lawyer's shingle, and almost immediately gets into politics, and he is fast. He wins a seat on Edmonton City Council in 1904, and then at the end of 1906, he runs for the top job and takes it with more than 60% of the vote in a 3-way race. Mayor of Edmonton. He is 28 years old. And another side note, Alberta had only just become a province in 1905. So this young guy is now mayor of the capital city of a brand new province. He's 28 years old, and the local papers promptly tag him Edmonton's boy mayor. And here's the kicker. The genuinely remarkable fact confirmed straight from the city's own archives more than a century later, he is still the youngest mayor in Edmonton's history. Think about that for a second, because I think it's the key to the whole man. By 30, William Griesbach has already been to war on the other side of the planet. and run a frontier city that was, at the time, exploding. Edmonton in this era is one of the fastest growing places in the country. This is a man with enormous energy and, let's be honest, enormous ambition, who genuinely cannot sit still. Law, politics, soldiering, he's doing all of it at once. Because alongside the political career, the military thing never stops. In 1906, he takes a commission as a lieutenant in the 19th Alberta Dragoons, a militia cavalry unit, horse soldiers, and makes captain in 1907. And that's the man, fully formed by about 1910. Lawyer, ex-mayor, ex-Boer War trooper, militia cavalry officer, a coming man in a coming city. If you'd asked anyone in Edmonton in 1913 to bet on whose name would still be on the map in 100 years, they might well have picked him. But not for any of those reasons. Not the law, not the politics, not even South Africa. The reason his name is on the map, the reason there's a bronze horse, is what he did in 8 days in January of 1915. When the war comes in August 1914, the 19th Alberta Dragoons volunteer as a unit, and Griesbach is among the first to put his hand up. But the thing he becomes famous for isn't cavalry. In December 1914, he's promoted to major and handed a job that, on paper, sounds almost impossible. Raise a battalion from Edmonton from scratch. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you already feel the floor tilt under you because this is our battalion. This is the spine of this entire podcast, really. The unit Griesbach is being told to conjure out of thin Alberta air is the 49th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. Authorized the 7th of November, 1914, the unit that will become known as the Edmonton Regiment and whose lineage carries down to the loyal Edmonton Regiment that still soldiers on today and whose museum, some of you may know, I'm lucky enough to be working in right now. A full infantry battalion in 1915 is on the order of 1,000 men. Griesbach is told, go find them. And here's the number that, if it weren't so well documented, you would not believe. He does just that in 8 days. January 1915, Edmonton is a city of maybe 72,000 people. Out of a city that size in the dead of an Alberta January, William Griesbach raises 1,000 men in just over a week. It's absolutely mind-boggling. But what does it actually feel like to be one of those 1,000? I want to slow down here, though, and resist the easy version of this story because the easy version is a beer commercial. Plucky, frontier cities, square-jawed boy mayor, 1,000 eager lads signing up in a week to go lick the Kaiser. Roll credits. Nicholson, and this is where the official history is so useful because it refuses to be a beer commercial. Nicholson situates these 1914-15 recruiting waves in something much more complicated. A huge share of those early volunteers across Canada were recent British immigrants, men born in England or Scotland, like my great-grandfather, in Canada only a few years, answering a call to a home. Many of them had left as children or had never really left at all in their hearts. Edmonton in 1915 was full of exactly those men. So when we say Griesbach raised 1,000 Edmonton men, we should be honest that a great many of them were, in a sense, going back. That's not less moving. It's differently moving, and it's truer, in a sense. And here's the other thing the clean number hides. 8 days to sign up 1,000 men is not the same as 8 days to make a battalion. What Griesbach actually spends 1915 doing is the unglamorous alchemy that Tim Cook is so good about. Turning clerks and farmhands and railwaymen and homesick Englishmen into something that can survive contact with the Western Front. Drill, discipline, the slow manufacture of the thing soldiers call cohesion, which is mostly just men learning they can trust the man beside them not to run. The 49th sails for England in June 1915 and crosses to France in October. And from there, it goes into the meat grinder of the whole Canadian Corps experience. It fights as part of the 7th Infantry Brigade, 3rd Canadian Division. And if you read the battle honors off the 49th's colors, it's basically a tour of every name that haunts this podcast. There's Montserrat, the Somme, Fleurs Courcelette. Yes, that Courcelette, the one we did the whole Chip Kerr episode around. Vimy, Hill 70, Passchendaele, Amiens, the pursuit to Mons. Griesbach himself doesn't stay with the battalion to the end. He's good, clearly good. And in February 1917, he's bumped up to a temporary brigadier general and given command of the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade, 1st Canadian Division, which means that when the Canadian Corps does the thing at Vimy in April 1917 that gets mythologized into the birth of a nation, Griesbach is there as a brigade commander, not a battalion CO. He ends the war a decorated general, Distinguished Service Order, and the sources say he earned it twice. Companion of various orders, the whole chest of ribbons. And then, because of course he does, he gets elected to Parliament while still in uniform overseas. MP, Member of Parliament for Edmonton West, December 1917. Senator by 1921. Stays a senator for over 20 years, basically until he dies. And when the Second World War comes and he's in his 60s, he can't help himself. He puts the uniform back on as Inspector General of the Army for Western Canada. He dies of a heart attack on the 21st of January, 1945, buried with full military honors. So that's the man whose name ends up on the map. And you can already feel why it's this man, can't you? Not just a soldier, but the soldier who is Edmonton's army story. The through line from the Boer War to 2 world wars, the boy mayor turned general turned senator. If you were going to carve one name into the north side of this city, you'd carve his. But here's what's strange, and we have to be straight about. The base named after him wouldn't open until 1950. 5 years after he was already dead. Griesbach the man never served at, lived at, or set foot on Griesbach the base because it didn't exist in his lifetime. The name is an act of memory laid down after the fact, which is a very on-theme thing for this show, so file it away. Almost everything in this story is something built on top of something else and named for someone who isn't there anymore. Speaking of which, what was there before the army? Whose ground is this, anyway? Okay, I want to be careful and honest in this part, including honest about the limits of what I can tell you, because the deeper you go in time, the thinner the paper trail gets, and the thinner the paper trail, the more tempting it is to make things up, and we're not going to do that. But we can go a lot further down than a plaque ever will, so let's dig this hole properly. Start at the bottom, or what we feel like could be the bottom. Long before there was a base, before there was a single survey stake in the ground, before there was a fur trade fort on the riverbank. This is Treaty 6 territory, and I don't mean that as a line you read fast and skate past. I mean it as the first and deepest layer of the whole concept. For thousands of years, this stretch of the North Saskatchewan country was home and highway to the Cree, Plains Cree and Woodland Cree, and shared, contested, and traveled by the Blackfoot Confederacy and by Nakota, Saulteaux, Dene, and others, and it's the heartland of the Métis Nation. This was bison country, river valley country. It was a web of trails and camps and gathering places. People didn't pass through here. They lived here for a span of time that makes the Army's 50 years look like an afternoon. The Cree name for this place, for Edmonton, is Amiskwachie-Waskagan, which roughly translates into Beaver Hills House. The fur trade arrives at the very end of the 1700s. 1795, the Northwest Company throws up Fort Augustus, and the Hudson's Bay Company plants Edmonton House right beside it, on the river. And for the next century, Edmonton is that post, a fur trade hub. It was a meeting point of Cree and Métis and company men, the place the pemmican and the furs and the kinship networks all knotted together. The city we know grows straight out of that knot. Then comes the part that rearranges everything. Treaty 6, signed in 1876, and right behind it, the surveyors. Because once the land is treated and the buffalo are gone, Ottawa wants the prairie turned into property. And the instrument for that is the Dominion Land Survey, that ruthless, beautiful grid of townships and 1 mile sections and 160-acre quarter sections laid right over top of the older world. $10 and 3 years proving up. Build a dwelling, break some acres, and a quarter section was yours. That's the machine that converts Cree and Métis homeland into a chessboard of homesteads. And this is where I have to be precise about geography because it's easy to blur, and the blur can do real harm. 2 of the chapters people reach for when they talk about Indigenous Edmonton are largely not the Griesbach parcel. The Papas Chase or Papasdale Cree, Chief Papachase's people, had their reserve. Papas Chase Indian Reserve number 136. This sat basically in the Rossdale Flats of Edmonton, the river flats. So it went from pretty well just the downtown area. It crossed south of the river in what's now south central Edmonton, and it went all the way down south to almost just what used to be the edge of the city about 20 years ago. This chunk of land was a huge swath of land. It was large. And it was surrendered in 1888 under intense settler and government pressure. A surrender the Papas Chase descendants and many historians regard as illegal, with members scattering to Enoch, just west of the city, and other Treaty 6 communities, other reserves like Alexander Reserve, just north of the city near Morinville, all the way south to Musquecheese, which is about an hour's drive south of here. Its people were scattered. It is one of the genuinely shameful chapters of this city's beginnings, and the famous Métis River lots, those long, narrow ribbons running back from the water, the even-numbered ones on the north bank tied to the old Hudson's Bay Company families, those hugged the river. So did the Hudson's Bay Company Reserve, that 1,600-acre block the company finally threw on the market in the great 1912 land rush. But that was downtown, roughly 101st to 121st Street, river up to 122 Avenue. Now, if you're from Edmonton, you know what a large area this can be, and it still is. Griesbach is none of those. Griesbach sits well north of all of it, up around 137th to 153rd Avenue today, which tells you exactly what was in, say, 1905. It was farm country on the far northern fringe of a boomtown, where I am sitting right now. Farm country back then, homestead quarter sections broken by plow out past the edge of the surveyed city in the same belt where the little village of North Edmonton, 4 quarter sections and all of 404 people in 1911, got itself incorporated in 1910 before Edmonton swallowed it. That's the texture of this ground before the soldiers. It was prairie sky, section roads, grain, a thin scatter of farms, the city's appetite creeping north toward it, one annexation at a time. And I will tell you that where I live right now, where I am sitting, this particular property was actually farmland until about 1964. I live pretty much maybe a 5-minute drive as the crow flies from the old Griesbach base. So we're on the same parallel here. So here's the honest gap. Now much narrower than I could draw it before. I can tell you with confidence the kind of place this was. Treated Cree and Métis homeland, surveyed into homestead quarters, farmed on the northern edge of a city that was racing outward to meet it. And hold one name in your head as we go along here, because we're going to come back to him, a young Cree man named Alex Decoteau, Olympic runner, Edmonton's own, a soldier of our battalion, the 49th. Park him there for now. He closes this whole circle later on in the podcast. What we can say for certain is when the army finally arrives and why. The base is established in 1950, and its first job is almost comically unglamorous. It's an ordnance depot, a storage and supply operation, a warehouse for the machinery of war, not a parade ground showpiece, a back-of-house logistics yard. But to understand why here, why now, you have to feel the temperature of the world in 1950, and the temperature is cold. This is the early Cold War. NATO is 1 year old. The Soviets have just tested a bomb. And up here on the northern edge of the populated world, Edmonton suddenly matters in a way it never did before. Because the shortest line between North America and the Soviet Union runs over top of the planet, over the Arctic. Edmonton becomes, in the phrase everybody used, the gateway to the north. The bones of this had been laid in the previous war, and I talked about it a little bit in our aviation podcast episode. Edmonton's military aviation story runs back at least 1940 or earlier, when RCAF Station Edmonton opened at Blatchford Field, the old city centre airport. And during the Second World War, the city was the hinge point on the northwest staging route and the building of the Alaska Highway, with a heavy American presence flying aircraft northward toward Alaska and via Alaska to the Soviet ally. The U.S. built a big airfield north of the city, the field that eventually becomes the other base in this story, the air base at Nemeo. So, by 1950, you have this whole northern military geography clicking into place, and the Army plants Griesbach barracks into the middle of it. It grows from a depot into something much bigger. It becomes the home of Western Command Headquarters, the nerve center for the Army across the western half of the country. The warehouse becomes the headquarters. The back of house becomes the house. And once you're a headquarters, you need soldiers. And once you've got soldiers, you've got families. And once you've got families, you've got the thing I grew up calling the base. You've got a town inside a city. So let me take you inside the gate. Here's the thing about a military base that civilians who didn't grow up around one often don't get. It's not just a workplace with tanks. It's a neighborhood with a chain of command. It has houses and a school and canteen and hockey teams and lawn mowing standards and gossip and first kisses and somebody's dad who's away too much. It is, in almost every way that matters day to day, it's a small town that happens to belong to the Department of National Defense. And that can be packed up and posted across the country on the Army's schedule rather than yours. Growing up, I had a lot of friends who sort of came and went from my life because they lived on the base. The houses had a name, PMQs, Permanent Married Quarters. There were rows of them, solid and practical, where the families of serving members lived. Some of those PMQs were single-family dwellings, very post-war gable-roofed homes with 2, maybe 3 bedrooms, and the others were like row houses, townhouses. And those PMQs are where my own thread ties into this, because in the 1980s, my stepdad's Army buddies were still living in them, and visiting was just a thing we did. You drove in, you parked the land yacht. You went in for coffee that turned into pizza supper that turned into the kids being told to go outside. That world was real and ordinary, and I had no idea at the time that I was a tourist in the last years of a thing that was about to vanish. Let me walk you through who actually filled the place across its life, because the roll call is genuinely something. The infantry came in the late 50s. In 1958, the 2nd Battalion, PPCLI, relocates to Griesbach from Currie Barracks down in Calgary, the Patricias. If the 49th and the Loyal Eddies are the Edmonton Infantry Regiment in spirit, the PPCLI become the beating heart of the actual living base for decades. Over the years, you get one PPCLI arriving in 1970 from Work Point Barracks out in Esquimalt, and eventually 3 PPCLI, my stepdad's battalion, tied to the place too. Also in 1958, and this is a side of base life nobody puts in the brochure, Griesbach gets a prison. Number 14 Service Prison and Detention Barracks, the DB in Army slang, because an army that big needs somewhere to hold its own when discipline breaks down. And the people who lived there will tell you that the DB was just part of the furniture of the place. A town inside a city, remember, and towns have jails. Then comes the bureaucratic plot twist. In 1968, the Canadian forces unify. So Navy, Army, Air Force folded into one green uniformed service. A genuinely controversial reorganization we could do a whole other episode on. And as part of that whole reshuffling, on the 1st of April 1966, Griesbach barracks and the air base at Namao get formally lashed together under one name, CFB Edmonton. The army base in the city and the air base north of it become two halves of one whole. And that air base connection is the setup for the single best fact in this entire episode, because the runway sitting north of the city wasn't just a runway anymore. It was a monster. It was a Cold War strategic airfield, and the prairie weather around Edmonton is, as the paratroopers themselves put it, basically ideal for jumping out of airplanes. Big skies, predictable conditions, lots of empty country to land in. So where do you put Canada's brand new elite parachute force? You put it here. On the 8th of April, 1968, the Canadian Airborne Regiment is officially formed, and it is born at CFB Edmonton, the Maroon Beret, an all-volunteer regiment of active paratroopers built as Canada's rapid reaction force, defense of the country, UN standby, peacekeeping, disaster response, the works. The regiment assembles here at Griesbach with one wrinkle the records are lovely about, which is that 1st Commando, drawn from the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Vendus, stays back in Valcartier for a while so that the French language infrastructure, the schools, can be set up in Edmonton first. That detail tells you it really was families, not just fighters. And the rest of the parachute world clusters in around the regiment. In 1970, the Canadian Parachute Training Centre moves to Griesbach from RCAF Station Rivers in Manitoba. The Canadian Airborne Centre, the school that taught Canadians to jump, sets up here too. And so does the Canadian Forces Parachute Maintenance Depot, the people who packed and inspected the chutes. For a while in the 70s, if you were a Canadian soldier earning your jump wings, the odds were very good that you did it right here on the north side of Edmonton. This is the world my stepdad came out of. 3 PPCLI and airborne, the way other people say a hometown. When he talked about the base, this is the texture under the words, the maroon berets, the jump towers, the particular swagger of men who throw themselves out of an aircraft for a living, and underneath all of it, the unspectacular reality of married quarters and school runs and somebody always being away on exercise. The Airborne Regiment only stayed 9 years. In 1977, it moved east to CFB Petawawa in Ontario, folded into the new Special Service Force. Partly, the histories say, because somebody in Ottawa noticed that Canada's shrinking army was weirdly top-heavy in the west. A full brigade plus the airborne out here on the prairie, far from where the population and the NATO commitments actually were. But the parachute schools and the maintenance depot stayed in Edmonton for years afterward, so the jump town flavor lingered long after the regiment's colors went east. And I have to be honest with you about the rest of the airborne story, because holding the complexity is the whole deal on this show. The regiment that was born here at Griesbach in 1968 was, in 1995, disbanded in disgrace, shut down by the government in the wake of the Somalia affair, one of the darkest scandals in the modern history of the Canadian forces. I'm not going to relitigate Somalia in this episode. It deserves its own, done properly. But I'm not going to pretend the maroon beret is an uncomplicated symbol either. A thing can be born in pride here and end somewhere painful, and both of those are true. And the bronze and the brochures in the neighborhood today don't always make room for the second half. We will. Because by the time the airborne is disbanded in 1995, the clock is already running out on the base itself. Now, here's the irony at the heart of how the base died. It didn't die because it failed. It died because the city succeeded. When Griesbach barracks went in back in 1950, it was on the edge of the town, out past the built-up part of Edmonton, room to breathe, room to drill. But Edmonton spent the next 40 years doing what booming Canadian cities do. It grew outward and it grew right up to the fence line and then, in spirit, straight past it. By the early 1990s, a 600-acre army base with parade squares and a detention barracks and warehouses was sitting in the middle of a residential city. Prime land, awkwardly placed, expensive to run. And then the other shoe drops, and it's a fiscal one. The mid-1990s are the era of deep Department of National Defence budget cuts. Ottawa looks at the Edmonton region and asks the obvious, brutal question. Why are we running two separate bases here? You've got the army at Griesbach inside the city, and you've got the big air base at Nemeo to the north. In 1994, RCAF Nemeo is transferred to Army control, and the decision crystallizes. Consolidate everything north at the Nemeo site, which gets rebuilt as CFB Edmonton Steel Barracks, the Edmonton garrison that's still the home of Western Canada's army today. Which means Griesbach has to go. And it goes the way these things always go, not in a single dramatic moment, but as a long, grinding, draining away. Through the second half of the 90s, the units pack up and head north up 97th Street to the new garrison, which is only about a 10-minute drive maybe, or they scatter to bases across the country. The parachute schools and the maintenance depot ship out to Trenton in 1996. One PPCLI moves up to Nemeo. Piece by piece, the town inside the city is hollowed out from the inside. Griesbach Barracks officially closes in 2000. The service prison had already shut down and moved to the new site in 2001. The land, all of it, hundreds of acres, including those roughly 750 married quarters where my stepdad's friends had lived, gets transferred out of military hands in a deal valued at about $17.5 million to the Canada Lands Company. That's the federal crown corporation whose whole job is to take surplus government property and redevelop it. The handover is finalized by 2003. And then the part I find genuinely hard to talk about even now, because I would drive past that location so often, so many times. Griesbach was and still is part of my daily drive. They knocked it down, not all of it at once. It was a handful of buildings, and the north side PMQs got kept for a while, folded into the early redevelopment. But over the next decade and change, almost all of it came down. The original roads, the barracks, the warehouses, drill hall, the DB, the parade square I learned to drive a Ford LTD around, the streets that were so beautifully, eerily empty on a 1980s afternoon, with their old street signs from the 50s, those white ones with the black trim and black printing, gone, scraped flat, surveyed into something new. And there was a particular grief to watching a place you knew get unbuilt. It's not like a building burning down. That's a tragedy. It's sudden and it's loud. This was quiet and administrative and planned. This was a place being thoughtfully, professionally, even respectfully erased, one demolition permit at a time, to make room for something that, and I want to be fair here because it's true, a lot of people would consider better, because what they built on top is, by most measures, a success. And a little side note here, to this day in 2026, there are small final sections of the base that are still being demolished and new buildings going up. This has been a very long process. This has been a 23-year process of watching this place get unbuilt. So let's stand in it today. Walk it with me, because I do this for real. But first, the unbuilding and rebuilding, because the how is important. The land passes from the Department of National Defence to Canada's Lands Company, a federal crown corporation, remember, not the city. The city's role is as the planning authority that approves the master plan and folds the new neighborhood into Edmonton. And right around 2003, the bulldozers get to work. The PMQs came down, the barracks came down, everything came down, down, down. Through the 2000s, a handful of buildings in some of the North Side Mary corridors kept on for a while and then mostly gone too. And in their place rises the thing the planners actually wanted. Not a cul-de-sac subdivision, but it was a new urbanist village. Front porches, back lanes, narrow walkable streets, a real center. Substantially built out by 2018 with one last big northeast corner, 150 odd acres, couple thousand more homes still to come. A chunk of it earned LEED for Neighborhood Development Gold, the first project in Edmonton to land that international green design certification. And it is physically lovely. It's beautiful. Where there was a parade square and warehouses, there are now 4 lakes, which do double duty as stormwater management, genuinely clever, and walking trails, a big central park, and the 2-acre community garden, and rows of those character homes with the deep porches the marketing's so proud of. People love living here. The vacancy rate is basically nil. On paper, it's a triumph. And it is a gorgeous community. And here's the part that matters for us for this show. They did not wipe the slate. Whatever else you want to say about a crown corporation selling lots, somebody made a deliberate, almost stubborn decision to build the memory of this place into the bones of the new one, and not in a vague, tasteful, brushed aluminum way, specifically, street by street. And this, for me, is where they found their redemption, in my opinion. Because nearly every street in Griesbach is named for a soldier or a battle, and not random ones. The battles local units actually bled in. The soldiers Edmonton actually sent. And here's the gut punch for regular listeners. Walk a few blocks and you'll hit Kerr, as in Private John Chipman Kerr, VC, our Chip Kerr, the 49th, the Victoria Cross at Courcelette, the whole episode we just did. There's a street with his name on it in the neighborhood named for the man who raised his battalion. A couple of turns away, there's Kinross, Private Cecil John Kinross, VC, also of the 49th, who earned his Victoria Cross at Passchendaele in 1917 in a battle that left, by some counts, 145 of the battalion's roughly 600 men standing. There's Galt, for Brigadier General Andrew Hamilton Galt, the man who raised and bankrolled the PPCLI battles, regiments, Victoria Crosses, peacekeeping missions, the whole arc of Edmonton's service, spelled out in street signs. And it doesn't stop at the signs. At the end of the streets there are, or were, and I'll get to that, interpretive panels, little plaques on brick and concrete stands, one per street, each one telling you the actual story of the actual soldier or battle the street is named for. The whole neighborhood is built to turn an after-dinner dog walk into a history lesson, whether you signed up for one or not. I cannot tell you how much I love that as a concept. A kid on a bike in Griesbach is physically surrounded by the names of the dead with the footnotes attached. The place is even zoned loosely by service. There's a whole army corridor centered on Patricia Park, with its PPCLI memorial, dedicated to the roughly 2,000 Patricias who've died in the regiment's service over its first century. There's a tribute to the Royal Canadian Engineers built around a Bailey Bridge, that brilliant prefab truss bridge the Allies threw across rivers in the Second World War. The panel there will tell you the longest one ever built, the Blackfriars Bridge, spanned the Rhine at Ries, Germany, at something like 558 meters. There's a Navy corner, Bedford Basin, named for the great wartime anchorage at Halifax, with a replica ship and a life ring tribute and a nod to HMCS Nonsuch. Edmonton's own Naval Reserve Division, because yes, the landlocked Prairie City has a Navy. And then there's an Air Force corner, Roundel Lake and Ad Astra Monument, to the stars. A 10-meter stainless steel starburst unveiled in September 2015, Alberta's Lieutenant Governor on hand, at a ceremony where 8 streets were renamed for 8 RCAF veterans, living ones, who got to stand there and watch their own names go up. And built right into the middle of it all is the Kipnis Center for Veterans, a long-term care home opened around 2005. So some of the men honored in the street signs aren't just commemorated here, they are living out their last years on the very ground they trained on. It's kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? And at the front door, at the roundabout, on his bronze horse, William Griesbach himself with a statue of his wife, Janet, nearby. The cavalry officer, the man of the 19th Alberta Dragoons, the man who raised 1,000 Edmontonians in 8 days, a general dead since 1945, presiding over a stormwater pond and a community garden he probably could never have dreamed of. Now, remember the name I told you a little while back? There's a street in Griesbach called Decoteau. Alex Decoteau, born 1887 on the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. He had a Cree mother and a Métis father who was murdered when Alex was a small boy. A boyhood that ran through the Battlefield Industrial School, one of the residential schools, which is a sentence I will not glide past because of what it means and what it costs. He comes to Edmonton, and in 1909, he becomes the first Indigenous police officer in Canada. He is also one of the finest distance runners this country has ever produced. He runs the 5,000 meters for Canada at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. And when the war comes, he enlists the 202nd Battalion first, and then our battalion, the 49th. He's killed by a sniper at the Second Battle of Passchendaele on the 30th of October, 1917, while doing the thing he was born to do, running, carrying a dispatch across that hellscape, 3 weeks short of his 30th birthday. The story goes that he was carrying a gold pocket watch the king had given him for winning a race in England, that the watch went missing off his body and that it was somehow recovered and sent home to his mother. That one's a beautiful, much repeated tale, so I'll flag it as a story rather than swear to it. In 1985, his community held a Cree ceremony to bring his spirit home. So follow the circle all the way around. So the land was Cree homeland before it was anything else. It became a homestead grid, then a parade square, then a suburb. And now on that exact ground, there is a street that carries the name of a Cree man, a residential school survivor, an Olympian, Edmonton's own, a soldier of the 49th, who died for the country that was at the very same moment doing everything in its power to erase people like him. Equal on the battlefield, not equal at home. But the fact that a kid in Griesbach can stand at the end of Decoteau Street and read his name off a panel, that is the oldest layer surfacing through all the others. And here's the thing about those interpretive panels. The or were I promised you. In the summer of 2017, somebody went through Griesbach in the dark and ripped out around 15 of them. The plaques for the soldiers and the battles pried off their stands and carried away, including, the report said, the ones for the Victoria Cross men, for Kerr and Kinross, and for Alex Decoteau. The community thought at first, scrap metal thieves, except the plaques aren't really bronze. They're a metal alloy worth almost nothing melted down, so that motive never quite made sense. They were eventually recovered, damaged. And I keep turning that over because it's such a strange, small, bleak little parable. The memory in this neighborhood isn't abstract and it isn't safe. It's bolted to a post at the end of a street, and a post at the end of a street can be unbolted. Remembrance takes maintenance. It takes a community that notices when 15 of its dead go missing overnight and says, no, put them back, which Griesbach did. But it's worth knowing how thin the line is between a neighborhood that remembers and a neighborhood that just has unusual street names. So here's where I want to land this, and I'm not going to tie it up with a bow because I don't think it should be tied up with a bow. There is real and honest tension in a place like the village at Griesbach, and I think you can hold both ends of it at the same time without flinching. On one end, this is the remembrance done unusually well. Most new suburbs are built on erased land with bland names, maple this, heritage that, names chosen by a focus group that mean nothing. Griesbach actually kept faith with what was here. It named a street for a battle a local kid died in. It put a real veteran's home in the middle of the neighborhood. It left the man on his horse. A kid growing up in those character homes today is going to ask at some point, why is my street called that? And the answer is going to be a true and serious one. And if the parents don't have the answer for their kid, the interpretive panels do. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. Now, on the other end, and I say this as someone who loves the place, remembrance is also a real estate amenity here. Built with history, built to last is a sales slogan. The military heritage is, among other things, a brand. And it sells lots, and there's something worth sitting with in the fact that the same instinct that preserves the memory also packages it. And the memory that gets packaged is mostly the clean version. The boy mayor, the 8 days, the man on the horse, the version on the panels, not the detention barracks, not Somalia, and not, for the most part, the deepest layer, the Treaty 6 layer, the Cree and Métis homeland this all sits on top of. Decoteau Street is the one place that layer breaks the surface, and even that reads, if you're not paying attention, as just another soldier's name. The brochure won't tell you the ground was Cree before it was a quarter section, before it was a parade square. We just did previously, and even we had to admit that we still don't know the names of the homesteaders who broke this soil between survey and the army. The record thins. Now I'm working on it. The editing is partly deliberate and partly just what time does. The remembrance is real and it's curated. It honors and it edits. And I don't think the answer is to be cynical about it. Cynicism is cheap and it's lazy, and it would be a betrayal of the men actually buried under those battle honors. But I don't think the answer is the brochure either. I think the answer is to do exactly what we just did. Walk the streets, read the names, and then ask the next question. Who was he, really? What was here before? What got kept and what got scraped flat? Who's remembered on the sign and who isn't going on any sign at all? I still drive through there, quite often. It's part of my daily. The land yacht is long gone, although, honestly, part of me hopes some teenager somewhere is still terrorizing an empty parking lot in a car the size of a boat, because that is a sacred Alberta right, and it should never die. But yes, I drive through Griesbach and I pass the man on the horse, and I think about my stepdad, 3 PPCLI and Airborne, and his buddies in the PMQs, and the coffees that turned into pizza and rye whiskey, and the particular quiet of those streets on those 1980s afternoons and evenings. And I think about the 1,000 men in 8 days, and the Maroon Berets, and the Riverlot families, and the Cree and the Métis, whose country this was before any of it. Layer on layer on layer. A neighborhood that is, if you know how to read it, one of the most densely remembered places in this city, and also, in places, one of the most quietly forgotten. We just called it the base. Turns out it was holding a lot more than we ever said out loud. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Memory and Valor. It's been fun. It's been super interesting. It's been a heck of a research journey, and I've loved every second of it. If your family homesteaded north of the city before 1950, or lived in those PMQs, or jumped out of airplanes over Edmonton, or you just want to argue with me about closure dates, and please do, I flagged about 30 things in this script I'm still chasing down. You know where to find me. Email me. Let's chat about it. If you're an army brat who was based at Griesbach, let me know. And here's the last gift I have for you in this episode. Very recently, like just days ago, I've developed a self-guided walking tour of the Griesbach neighborhood. It's completely free, and it's going to be part of the Edmonton and District Historical Society 30th Anniversary Historic Festival and Doors Open Edmonton, occurring July 5th to 12th. However, the walking tour is available to you now. Go to my website, www.memoryandvalor.com. valor.ca. Remember, that's valor with an O-U-R. And there will be a link on there that says the Griesbach Walk. Click on that, and that will take you to the instructions for the self-guided walking tour. And you start at Griesbach's statue. From there, you follow the instructions. You click on stop number 1. There will be some audio there for you, just briefly explaining a bit of the history, instructions to walk to the next stop. And it starts not far from where all the shops are on the base. So grab yourself a cup of coffee. There's a Tim Hortons right there, or if you want something better, I think there's boba tea and everything too. So grab yourself something to drink, get your backpack, bring your earbuds, and go for the walking tour. It's going to be fun. I'm super excited about it. I'm really excited to have people go on the walk. And like I said, if you need to reach out to me because you've got some more history that needs to be added, you can get a hold of me at my email at memoryandvalor@gmail.com. Thanks for walking through this one with me. And remember, let's keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.